welcome back. We are going to start the last portion of the programming. Many of you may have met me this morning. If you've not, I'm Ben Prosky. I'm the Assistant Dean for Communications at the school. So in this last portion, you will hear from people who are very active at the school, both students and faculty. And because we think incredibly highly of them, we have set them a performance task. And I will just explain to you very briefly what that is, if you have not heard of a Pecha Kucha. So Wikipedia does tell me that Pecha Kucha is Japanese for chit-chat. And it literally means that you get 20 slides for 20 seconds each, and they are programmed themselves, so the speakers cannot control their slides. So it is a real test as to whether they can, perform without any control. And people in this school giving up control, it's a high order, tall order. So they will come up here one by one. They will give their concise presentations, and afterwards we will invite them up to the table where they will be available for questions and answers and discussions, and following which we will wrap up the day with cake and drink and merriment. So the order of the Pecha Kucha presentations will be Nina Chase, who is Landscape Architecture, 2012. Danielle Etzler, who is Assistant Professor of Architecture. Haley Chen, who is Masters of Architecture, 2012. Kyle Moe, Assistant Professor of Architectural Technology. Peter Christensen, Masters of Design, 09, and also PhD in 2015. George Legendre, Adjunct Associate Professor of Architecture. Danny Ibanez, MDes, 2012, and Inga Rocker, Associate Professor of Architecture. So since I've probably now taken up more time than they get, I'm going to pass the podium over to them, and we'll let the games begin. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nina, and it's really an honor to be here today. But I wanted to take you through my project Collect Park, which I completed with my friend and colleague Anna Korse, who's also an MLA too. And this project was just selected as a winning entry in the By the City for the City design competition, which was sponsored by the Institute of Design in New York. And so for the competition, designers were asked to respond to a design solution to a question posed by a New Yorker. And we responded to number 608, which was posed by John Molina, who asked, wouldn't it be great if we started thinking about how to respond to the rising of water? How do we answer the threat that this imposes? But we didn't see the rising of water around New York City as a threat. We saw it as the opportunity. And we designed our park, Collect Park, as a soft infrastructure that would welcome increased rainfall and sea level changes, and to serve as an opportunity to shift perceptions on how to build and live in low-lying areas and how to reconnect and re-educate ourselves about water in a city. So we took a site in Lower Manhattan to look specifically at the issues of sea level rise, increased stormwater runoff and flooding, and the site is outlined here in red, and it sits right between the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges along the East River. And we started by looking at anticipated flooding in this area, where it would go and what that meant. And you can see in the medium dark blue the 6-foot sea level rise that's predicted, and then in the lightest blue, the 24-foot storm surge that would accompany Category 4 hurricane. And what would happen is that water would come in from the left from the Hudson River and then up from the East River and converge on our site. And we overlaid that analysis with the historic location of Collect Pond, which you can see in the middle in the dark blue, which was the original fresh water source for New York City, and then all of its neighboring streams. And what you see is that where the water wants to go today is actually where the water had been before. And so we took advantage of this lowland trajectory of the pond and the streams, and we and we located our Collect Park. And the park becomes this dramatic gesture across Lower Manhattan, and it serves as this green spine to collect stormwater, accept floodwater and rising sea levels. And then just for comparison, you can see that our park is about the length of the end of Central Park at the end there. And so to make this happen, Collect Park is designed on the premise of removing the seawall along the East River. Today, the East River edge cannot naturally respond to sea level rise. The existing seawall continues to create a false sense of security and actually speeds up the erosion of any barrier landscape that would appear. So without the barrier, the natural buffering marsh ecosystem will appear. And when you allow this to happen in a typical situation, 3 ecologic zones appear. You have a terrestrial zone, you have a high marsh, and a low marsh. And the cohesion of these 3 zones allows this system to work seamlessly and functions to buffer storms, allow tidal changes, it filters pollutants, and then provides natural habitats. So Collect Park, which is the outline in the dark gray you can see behind, became a system modeled after the function of these 3 naturally occurring ecological zones. And each zone, the terrestrial, high, and low, is multi-layered not only to respond to hydrology and plant ecology, but also to the cultural and programmatic needs of this community, which is the Two Bridges neighborhood in New York City. And you can see the master plan is a direct translation of these designed elements. Up at the top, number 1 is the terrestrial zone, which captures and conveys stormwater. Number 2 in the middle is the high marsh, which receives fresh water. And then 3 along the East River is the low marsh, which filtrates and aerates the water in this more constructed and managed marsh condition along the river. And so we took each of these systems and broke it out and developed it further. And so hydrology became the core defining system, closely paired with a planting strategy and then also a significant index of cultural elements to connect back to the neighborhood. And so, like I said, hydrology was really the main core infrastructure, and it's designed to accept rainfall from above and accept flooding from below. And this diagram shows we designed alternating settling and filtering ponds to accept rainwater, and then the constructed marsh is down on the lower right, and that accepts the floodwater that would flow up Collect Park. And in this perspective, you can see some of the larger filtering ponds that make up our filtering garden, and they're congregated closer to the end. So in the case of a flood, when sediment's deposited, it would be deposited in here and then used. And we also introduced a phased planting strategy, which was characterized by responsive growth and management throughout the park. The terrestrial vegetation included an urban forest, which was capable of being transplanted after a flooding event to replace lost vegetation. And then the marsh ecosystem down at the bottom eventually gets pushed upland as sea level rise occurs. And the plants were chosen specifically for their transplantability, salt tolerance, and growth rate, and we cross-referenced all those to find a perfect match. And the trees grown in the urban forest would be able to be replanted to replenish lost vegetation after a flood and begin the remediation process of any polluted soil and sediment. And then we phased that, which you can see in the diagram in the bottom. And then this was just a representation of that phasing. In 5 to 10 years, you have the islands off the edge of Collect Park initially, and then between 10 and 50 years, you have the marsh condition, which moves in and takes over and becomes the buffering landscape. We also introduced a number of cultural elements, including a newly activated edge with a kayak launch, docks, a promenade, an interactive fountain which also aerates the water before it goes into the East River. And then we have plaza space in the middle for farmers markets, outdoor space for residents and employees. We introduced some sport fields, multi-sport fields. Here you can see the farmers market location. And we also proposed the location for a climate change research center, which would serve as a hub and a partner for an urban agriculture initiative, which would include greenhouses, indoor composting, and then community gardens as well. And we recognize that sea level rise obviously is not an issue just for Lower Manhattan, so we used Collect Park as a prototype for similarly threatened neighborhoods in New York City, and we located other sites with similar issues such as Newtown Creek, the Harlem River, Willets Point, and the Gowanus Canal, and they all could utilize intercity green infrastructure as really an innovative solution to the consequences of sea level rise. And your turn.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I would like to talk a little bit about buildings. They are stubborn little buggers, and I think that they cause problems in ways for architects and for architecture that we do not anticipate. This, I believe, is primarily because they live not just in the minds of architects, but they live very active lives in the imagination of the public. Buildings are known to everyone, and their formal qualities are defined through personal experience of the built environment, which, as most of you in this room know, is not largely influenced by architects. This is evidenced by some of the hundreds of TV shows listed here on this slide that are dedicated to the subject of building. Some of my favorites include Man Caves and Date My House. Most of these television shows reinforce the personal nature of understanding what a building should be and do. I'd like to make a brief comparison. This is the Jackson House in New Hampshire. It's the oldest wood frame house in New Hampshire. It represents what I think are the knowable qualities of vernacular housing throughout the built environment of New England that the public has come to expect. The formal language that we see in the next house, which is Scott Cohen's Goodman House of the early 21st century, about 300 plus years later, contains elements of the same vernacular, but expands and reinterprets the formal properties as part of an intellectual inquiry. And I think the result can be considered by many architects to be sublime and quite beautiful, and I think to the public it may appear a distorted version of the original. But let's set aside buildings for the moment and talk about us. We are fabulous, according to the media. We are often depicted as living glamorous and privileged lives, as shown in the following picture, which is of the architect Lindy Roy in Vogue magazine in 2007. Media coverage of us, it's her helicopter that really does this for me. It's media coverage often reinforces the stereotype that we are above the rest of society, above the public. I think the reality of our professional lives couldn't be further from this Vogue spread. This is the 2007 cover of Architect magazine, the year in which the average salary for an intern was much less than the cost of an annual tuition at many architectural schools. Where these two things come together is often in the form of things like the 2010 Vanity Fair list of the 50 greatest buildings of the last 30 years. In this, Vanity Fair asked the deans of architecture schools, among them our own, and many other leading experts and leaders of the discipline of architecture to weigh in on what they believe to be were the top buildings of the last 30 years. And I think that in this, our intention is for us as experts to do our job and define what good architecture is and share it with the public in an effort to promote good design and the bettering of the built environment. I think, in fact, the disconnect is already so large that when the list comes out and it contains buildings that are largely not in the U.S. But overseas, and it is generated by people who the public does not know, it's frankly very hard to compete with man caves at this point, and to get the point across. So I think, in a way, this type of list making reinforces the divide that's already present in the culture. We ask a lot of buildings. We ask much more based on our education and our aspirations for them. This summer, I was at the Barcelona Pavilion for the first time, and while I was enjoying it, I noticed two types of tourists there. This is the Barcelona Pavilion, shown in its natural habitat. The two types of tourists that I saw were those enjoying the beautiful afternoon and the physical environment of the building, and then there were the architects who were laying on the ground taking pictures from a worm's eye perspective. And I was completely confused by this because there literally were people laying on the ground all over the place. When I came back to the GSD, I asked my students if they had been there and where they had taken their pictures from. And most of them had, in fact, taken pictures on the ground. This is a student of mine, and the next one is as well. And in this moment, what they're doing is trying to reconcile the disciplinary knowledge that they know of the building with the artifact of the building itself. But for me, there's something discomforting about having to distort the body, having to contort the body in order to achieve the building's intended intellectual effect. And it stayed with me. This is also a photograph from a student of mine from the Barcelona Pavilion. My contribution in the lobby for the GSD 075 exhibit juxtaposes abstract animations from my first-year studio at the GSD with footage from Extreme Home Makeover. The point of this, as described in the text that accompanies the exhibit, is to provoke us into reflecting on the consequences of generating a culture of architecture on our own terms that operates outside of the economy of the built environment. And while I think that an internal dialogue is necessary to advance the discipline, I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is not always directly applicable to the project of building. There's a particular emphasis on innovation. This is a slide from an ad campaign for Buddy Fruits. Buddy Fruits is a new way to eat fruit. And the fruit burger, for me, represents a degree of innovation that I think architects have come to demand from both the discipline of architecture and the project of building. If we come back to the Jackson House and the Goodman House, I think it's worth considering that the desire for innovation for architecture's rethinking of buildings based on an intellectual objective, however well-intended, can sometimes appear to the public as an abstraction of an original. I would like to conclude with this image taken in the lobby of Machado Silvetti's museum in Provincetown. It is a beautiful building. In this picture, which I took in the lobby, the architectural model is used as a donation box. Buildings are a physical and conceptual vessel for the public's imagination in ways that we as architects cannot control. Thank you.
Hi. I'm going to be talking about the work that I did this past summer, whenever the slideshow starts. This is a picture of 6916 South Dorchester Avenue on Chicago's South Side, one of many under-resourced Black neighborhoods in Chicago. And it happens to be next door to the home of an artist that was also a Loeb Fellow last year. This is that artist, our charismatic leader from the summer, Theaster Gates. He rehabbed the abandoned building into a library containing 60,000 art history slides that were being thrown away by the University of Chicago, the entire collection from Prairie Avenue Bookstore that went out of business of art and architecture books. And 4 of us went there over the summer to work as architectural practitioners. He gave us free housing, almost no money, and total creative control. So it was a very challenging and rewarding summer. And the ethos that runs through all of this comes from his art practice, where you find something discarded and turn it into something else. So these were floorboards from his studio that became a back deck. And the back deck in this backyard of this house became a movie theater for an artist residency that took place over the summer for the neighbors to see lost films that the Chicago Film Archive was curating and displaying and showing to people. And we were trying to bring this kind of cultural activity into a neighborhood that rarely sees that kind of work. This routine site work that we had to do for a future construction site was the removal of a 100-foot rotten silver maple. And instead of just letting this kind of banal act go unnoticed, we turned it into a several-week-long camp for the neighborhood kids. Because as designers, we're constantly representing sort of unspoken narratives. And we decided that we could use this as an opportunity to speak the narrative of the ecology of a neighborhood like that, and have the kids learn about the parts of the tree and talk about where wood comes from and talk about where paper comes from and think about how to play differently in their own backyards. And so that's actually a piece of the tree. And so for the week leading up to it, we did activities with them every single day that had to do with learning about different parts of the urban ecology right around their own homes, and also the animals that live there, and thinking about the way that it was a member of their community. and we tried to endow them with some sense of systems thinking, of finding treasure out of trash. This discarded little strip of dirt in front of the fence we decided could be a demonstration garden for low-maintenance perennials. And doing work in front of your house in the South Side, people will constantly come ask you questions and be like, what's that? What are you doing? What are those plants? And it was just this moment where we could share all the knowledge that we had about planting and using discarded materials to just create something more vibrant on this block that was kind of just littered with flaming hot Cheeto bags. So what else? This piece of dirt on the other side of the fence is in front of the library, and it's this pseudo-public space that we just decided really needed to be something more, especially for an organization that sort of functions as both private and public space. Just a little bit of framing, the rest of the cladding from the deck, and a cubic yard of gravel. And we were trying to find a way to make it a viable space for neighbors to come and hang out and without being invited in necessarily. And the design and building of this included hiring two neighbors from down the street, a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, who rather than just paying them to lug around wood, we treated it like a design build workshop. And we had them draw their ideas, switch their drawings, and build each other's drawings. And they stayed late for hours that they weren't being paid, and it's amazing how quickly you can make somebody become totally anal retentive and perfectionist about the things that they're building. They had never picked up a power tool before, and by the end they were cutting and recutting, tearing the things that they had made if they weren't satisfied, and rebuilding. So really looking at architecture as community service, my insight into this from the summer is that every single moment of architecture can be neighborly and didactic and transparent. It can be a generative process throughout every design stage and every building stage, and you end up with a really rich product that is also a shared story and a shared history in a community where people have participated in its conception and its building. There's an outdoor classroom where there was nothing but dirt and mosquitoes, windows where there would normally be a fence, and conversations where there would normally be silence. It can transform vacancy into vibrancy, yard waste into keepsakes, nothing into something. And so I would like to leave you with the idea that architecture finds abandonment and sees opportunity.
Okay, as a graduate of this school, I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm going to speak about an ambitiously modest design-build project from my practice, inasmuch as it illustrates some aspects of my research and publications that deal with energy as a formal topic in the discipline of architecture. And there are a couple of key observations. The first is that matter is but an expression of captured energy. As such, its material practices are a subset of its energy practices. This makes the formation of energy, how it is shaped by architects and buildings, a primary concern for the discipline in this century. So one of my books looks at the topic of thermally active surfaces in architecture and begins by asking a very simple question, which is, why do we heat and cool buildings with air? Our physiology strongly prefers radiant transfer, and our bodies work this way because water is about 800 times more dense than air, and you can capture and channel much more energy with water. As such, our bodies are thermally active surfaces, and it is my view that buildings should finally occupy the same thermodynamic space as our bodies. The book thus asks what happens when the surfaces and structures of architecture also become the primary energy system in buildings, that is, when architecture begins to do much more work. My current book project focuses on aspects of architecture that have been untempered by the discipline, such as its extensive supply chains and material geographies, that also tell us something about some building physics that have been overlooked in the 20th century. These untempered milieus can grant much new agency and specificity to architecture. For instance, while the stunning glass architecture of the Toledo Glass Pavilion, which is coming up, produces some beautiful spaces, its supply chains are vulgar inasmuch as they squander opportunities to enrich the building and the larger collective that we live in through productive feedback loops that can make architecture do more as a form in this century. So with some of these thoughts in mind, we can go to the middle of nowhere in Colorado and look at the Stackhouse project that sits on a hill and overlooks the Arkansas River Valley and the 14,000-foot collegiate peaks beyond. The building is seemingly simple, a couple of wood walls with steel boxes that frame particular views in the adjacent landscape. And there's not much to see in the drawings of this small building. Most of its intricacy is non-visual. The roof, however, is a ruled surface, which means that every joist is different than the one before and after it. So one side of the roof is dead flat, while the other side of the roof has an asymmetrical belly leading to a scupper. This allows the roof to drain snow and rain to the scupper as a single architectural surface. It also made the roof and part skate park during the construction. Underneath the asymmetrical belly of the roof, it casts light about the interior, and it also bounces sound in a particular way as a space for performance and music. But it is the assembly of the building that is of most interest to me. The walls for this project are a single layer of solid 6x8 spruce timbers that are the structure, enclosure, insulation, and finish materials of the project. All of the wall's demands are converged in this one layer, an approach that runs counter to prevailing logics of construction and energy systems for buildings today. Once the timbers are stacked, their thermal performance becomes important. The spruce material is quite interesting from a thermal point of view because its cellular solid composition puts it somewhere between an insulator like a foam and more conductive materials like stone or steel. This thermal diffusivity, a parameter often ignored in contemporary building science, plays an important role in the Stackhouse. Although this building would fail to meet any energy code, the owner can sit inside wearing a t-shirt and shorts with no heat source other than the sun in mid-February when it is 10 below outside. How thermal energy behaves in wood and how our bodies relate to wood helps point to an alternate modality for thinking about the relationship of energy and architecture. But there are other forms of energy at stake in this project. Consider a more conventional wall that has a series of processes attached to it, some quite energy intensive, that collectively produce a rather dispersed material geography that is rarely considered by architects, but nonetheless are inextricably attached to this form of architecture. And in this case of lumber construction, it would yield a relatively high embodied energy value. In the stack approach, however, the single material allows me to know much more about the wall. For instance, the spruce for this project was grown, harvested, processed, and installed in the same valley as the project, and as such, it yields a much lower embodied energy value. But I'm only interested in these sorts of facts in a very marginal way. What is of greater concern to me as an architect is how these facts can affect the building. In this case, more money, material, and energy was lavished on the building than its externalities. It also enables specific architectural qualities that would otherwise be precluded. Yet my disciplinary concerns can nonetheless address some larger issues in the world. For instance, wood is the only building material that sequesters carbon. As a tree grows, it absorbs carbon, and that carbon is locked in the material until it decomposes or burns. If you deduct from that capacity the carbon required for all the materials in this building, then you end up with a surplus of sequestered carbon in this case. In other words, this net zero building sequesters about twice as much carbon as it took to build. But again, I'm only interested in these facts in as much as they yield some more agency and specificity for architecture. This building works the way it does not because of any efficiencies. It is a massively inefficient use of material. So it fundamentally reflects on an approach to architecture not based on ideas of scarcity, but rather one that aims for abundance and exuberance in architecture. And this occurs because its ecological facts are byproducts of its disciplinary choices. From the molecular realm of building physics to the territorial realm of its extensive architecture, there's much to be gained for architects when they temper these otherwise untempered environments. So as Rem Koolhaas once noted, the architect, for better or for worse, relates to the city like a surfer to the wave. But architecture and architects do not yet relate to the world like a surfer to the wave. They do not surf the wake of the materials and energies that presuppose the formation and construction of any building. I see this formation of energy itself, how architects shape forms of energy, towards some greater end, first and foremost as a formal project within the discipline of architecture. It can yield non-trivial forms that can trigger great abundance and exuberance for both architecture and the qualities of life in this century. Thank you.
I wish to thank all of you for the opportunity to be here on this auspicious occasion, celebrating 3/4 of a century of design and design research. I myself fall squarely in the latter category of design research as part of the school's small yet vibrant PhD program, of which I am now in my 3rd year. I also owe a special thanks to the organizers for allowing me to be here despite being ensconced in archival research in Berlin, where I am presently on a Fulbright. As the curatorial director of the 75th anniversary exhibition, it is particularly wonderful to finally see some of the protagonists of many of the dispatches populating the exhibition and actually engaging with it. The 75th anniversary exhibition, although topically very different from the subject of my dissertation, conflates the practice of history and the practice of representation in a way that has fascinated me since obtaining my architecture degree at Cornell in 2005. I was, quite frankly, a lousy designer, barely able to score chipboard, let alone solder, draft, or otherwise make magic in the shop. I found instead a passion for history that brought me to a curatorial post in the architecture and design department at MoMA. At MoMA, I became fixated with the way in which the past could be an interlocutor with the present, a preoccupation which became the foundation upon which my final project at the museum, the exhibition Home Delivery Fabricating the Modern Dwelling, was built. The show divided the history of the prefabricated house into a thorough historical survey spanning the late 18th century to the recent past, and a more experimental campus of 5 full-scale houses constructed in a lot adjacent to the museum amidst the office towers of Midtown Manhattan. I arrived at the GSD first to pursue an MDes and then a PhD with the expectation that my research would continue to concern itself with how to make history interesting to a large amount of people, not least of which included designers. I was, however, struck quite quickly with the suspicion, even sometimes the distaste, the academy at large held for all things populist. I had to recalibrate my research methods, my academic goals, and, most difficultly, the pace of my life, to actualize the fact that a PhD is supposed to be the creation of knowledge for knowledge's sake, not the utility of knowledge for the mobilization of energy and excitement for architecture in the contemporary sphere. That is all to say that my 12-year trajectory of practicing, then curating, then researching architecture seemed to suggest a formulaic and dearly held linear trajectory that implied that a veritable scholar should and could only build on the acts of design, representation, and curating if they were to be followed by multilingual, multi-archival, and visual research that could ultimately parlay a worthy dissertation into a job. Take my dissertation, for example, which will analyze the formulation of architecture in the context of German study of the Orient on a railway line entitled Die Bagdadbahn, constructed by German banks at the end of the 19th century. The line sought to connect the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires in ways that presaged their unity as a geopolitical bloc in the First World War, while also developing economic and cultural ties that modeled a novel form of quasi-imperial penetration of Turkish land that stood in contradistinction to British and French models of colonialism for its emphasis on pluralism, contextualism, and at least on the surface, multilateral interactions between ethnic and religious groups. German architects and engineers personified this unusual geopolitical imperative most vividly in architecture, whose most obvious exponents are train stations built in the crumbling Ottoman Empire between 1870 and the outbreak of war in 1914. But there are more unusual exponents as well. Jetties, sidewalks, bridges, tunnels, banks, traffic systems, fountains, sewers, and graveyards, all which materialized in direct correlation to the railway's construction, that make the railway much more than a mere line in the proverbial sand. It explicated, rather, German ideas of the primacy of land over water, of the necessity of geopolitical alliances, and a shifting belief that the cradle of civilization lay in the Middle East and not in Greece. The built components of the railway read, like their archives, as texts, which I hope have the promise to make an original contribution to architectural, art, and geopolitical history, and hopefully one day the ingredients of my first non-museum publication. When I explain this project, as I have so often done in the last few years, the reaction is typically met with two types of responses. The first, from my academic peers, who ask probing questions concerning specific figures, ideologies, or historical debates. The second reaction, which I may call the grandma and grandpa question, is, so what? My knee-jerk reaction after a few years of academic indoctrination is to say there is no, quote, utility for this project beyond the gaps it will fill in the body of knowledge that exists on our built environment. But such a response would not be acceptable at the GSD. To be sure, knowledge is treasured here and the production of it is a noble pursuit, but it cannot exist in a vacuum when one is surrounded by designers of all stripes. It must relate to their work, to today, to our contemporary political and architectural understanding of the Middle East, of Germany, and well beyond. To be forced to think on these questions, to not be self-satisfied, to converge knowledge, design, and representation with nuance and aplomb is to operate in a quintessentially GSD mode of alertness and to buck the convention. Thank you very much. And here's some shots from my field research.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. So Marco, my friend Marco and I share a professional address of Bermondsey Street in South London. Now, on most evenings, as you can see, we mill about the office's communal table to share impressions of the day, practical issues, delayed fees, contractual obligations, interim certificates. But first, we sit down and eat pasta. With its arcane symbols, the world of mathematics is a tough sell at the best of times, but not so with his book. In the course of planning it, we encountered time and again the warmest of reactions on receiving a sample of the unsolicited typescript. Our future editor at Thames and Hudson saluted enthusiastically our insanity. Named after the three Greek letters, pi, theta, and kappa, those three equations form the genetic code of Capelletti. This pasta is customarily served as the first course of the traditional North Italian Christmas meal, dished up in a chicken broth and filled with mixed meats or soft cheeses, such as ricotta. Now, solving the equations for j equals 0, j equals 1, and I equals 0 to 25 gives us the cross-section of pasta gramigna. We use this and other results to place the shape in the family tree. A specialty of the Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, gramigna is traditionally served as pasta asciutta with a chunky sausage sauce. Now, which technical advance excites me the most? Hempcrete, a new material we used for the bathhouse in the London Wetland Centre in 2009. Hempcrete is both primitive and advanced. A person patting a mix of hemp and glue with a wood stick can build a 2-story high load-bearing wall just like my great-great-grandfather did. Now, when you lose a competition, it's generally not a good idea to compare yourself to the winner. That said, apparently there's a website somewhere where you can upload an image of your entry alongside the winners and complain officially. Not a good idea then, except in this case. This is the winning entry. Now, there is, of course, no such thing as a freestanding 600-foot-tall billboard. Flatness would preclude all manners of stability, and the wind shear would finish the job in seconds. In our own entry, we used mathematics to deform the surface into stability. The ratio of the fold's width to height is about 1 to 12, a working high-rise ratio. We love boxes in my office, but are equally committed to tackling the challenge of continuity, which gets tricky when mundane orthogonality is concerned. We tend to avoid piecemeal assemblies, for instance, where each side is dealt with separately, considering instead alternative options, all of which produce bona fide blobs trying to pass themselves off as a box. I don't get the physical side of structure, but I have a good sense for its math. Math is only a game, after all, a risky game, perhaps, at which our academic standing may be gambled away in no time, but a game nonetheless, whereas physics is a fact of life. Without it, buildings would collapse and we'd have nowhere to live. When the engineer is a closet architect and the architect a closet engineer, the dialogue is tricky. Architects enjoy the artificial side of complexity, and hence, with its emphasis on material and economic behavior, the maturity of the engineering profession may forever elude us, along with its social standing and very high fees. My work is about novelty as well as type in the most traditional sense. But unlike the conspicuous types of the past, our new types are abstract and invisible. We do not recombine them, for instance, to make new projects, but calibrate relationships expressed for the sake of convenience in mathematical terms. The brief of Henderson waves is simple: to spring from a scenic point and land on a hill some 1,000 feet away. This picture was taken near the springing point, for instance, looking opposite. Bridges have typically simple briefs: to go from A to B. But our own internal brief was even simpler than that: to get there with one equation only. Using equations, we can write anything we want. Some results may remind us of forms derived by more traditional means, say by using Rhino or Maya. Where there is nothing, everything's possible, but here structure carried the day. This proved a sensible choice in hindsight, for having won the competition, we were also required to build it. To remain within the prescribed slope, the bridge bends while undulating. It deforms to provide access, shelter, scenic viewing for pedestrians, runners, and cyclists. The length of the deck exceeds 1,000 feet, and the difference in elevation between springing and landing is about the height of a 7-story block. Since opening in 2008, it has received over 1 million visitors. It's become a suburban park with stunning views of the South China Sea. It's a favorite family destination, a romantic hideout, and the outdoors wedding venue of choice. Its giddy height may even be the safest venue to walk a Cairn Terrier or any other very small dog breed. Our entry for MoMA PS1 is about domesticity. In other words, it pitches the bustling excitement of contemporary space against the enduring yearning for a log cabin in the woods. This courtyard here celebrates the spirit of modern living, in keeping with the now aesthetic. There are no doors or windows here. Visitors enter or exit through missing walls. This courtyard accommodates a structure that gives the project its name, the Ghost House. Here we strove to create what you would readily recognize as a house. But given our strategy of tensioning ropes between concrete walls, our low-fidelity house offers only the minimum features of houseness: a pitched roof and an eave. Despite appearances to the contrary, 97% of the proposal is made of polypropylene. Polypropylene is a light but tough plastic polymer, commonly used in clothing. In 1995, the artists Christo and Jean-Claude used the same braid to wrap up the Reichstag. Our Shenzhen Museum uses the elastic properties of a parametric surface known as the implicit field. By aggregating functions, the implicit field is defined by the discontinuities between them. It's also the basis for a building, deriving its structure, layout, and access to natural light wherever such discontinuities occur. And finally, an old novel in which the same meaningless event is retold in various dialects inspired my first foray into the surface in 2003. Here too, the surface appears in many guises, each using another vernacular, like the language of computation, for instance. Eventually, I wrote a recipe with functions for cooking ingredients. 8 years, 6 minutes, and 40 seconds later, we've just come full circle. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Daniel Ibáñez. I'm an MDes candidate in the Urbanism, Landscape, and Ecology concentration, and I'm very pleased to be able to present to you today the current status of the ecological urbanism application. Let me tell you in advance that this project has been made possible through the generous support of John Irving Jr. and the Dean's Office. So let me give you a little bit of background to understand what ecological urbanism is trying to respond to. So in order to do so, let's start with something we well know, as we find, for example, massive growth of global population as well as urban, and as it is shown in the image above, generally in the form of old or traditional planning in developed countries. But also, we find that in the emerging countries is where 90% of this growth is happening, and let's say what we could call in the informal city, or it has been called as well the non-formal. Either of those situations are leading to a massive use of resources, and as we can see in the series above, and poses the question of how are we going to address scarcity. At the same time, this leads to environmental exploitation and consequent ecological disasters generally associated with urban habitats. So for example, the dead zone around the Mississippi River Delta or the Gulf oil spill, just to mention one like very representative. But because it's not all about bad news, and as Moisen said, we need to view this fragility of the planet and its resources as an opportunity for speculative design innovation rather than promoting conventional solutions. And also, he quotes, imagining an urbanism that is other than the status quo requires a new sensibility, one that has the capacity to incorporate and accommodate the inherent conflictual conditions between ecology and urbanism. So, as you can all imagine, it's a very deep theme where many other issues are taking place, but I think that for a 90 seconds express introduction is fair enough. So based on these facts and some others, the GSD organized in 2009 the Ecological Urbanism Conference, inviting worldwide experts to lead the discussion around these issues. Coupled with this series of lectures, the GSD as well curated an exhibition showing different perspectives and ideas under this topic of ecological urbanism, and they posed the question saying, can urbanism be ever ecological? So basically around 1 year later, collecting all the information produced, the Ecological Urbanism book brought together practitioners, theorists, economists, engineers, artists, policymakers, and so on and so forth, with the goal of providing a multi-layered, diverse and nuanced understanding of ecological urbanism through a series of essays, basically. So what's next? With an archive that more than 7,000 images and over 100 essays, what should be done? So last year I went to talk to Moisen, and I said to him that I was thinking that the book was a great theoretical construct, but also that for me was still an unclear and difficult to recognize the projects associated with it. So what could be the best manner to visualize, illustrate, and catalog the main projects, initiatives around the ecological urbanism project? So that's what we thought, an application capable of compiling information from several spheres like academic, professional, scientific, from several disciplines as architecture, public health, biology, easy to navigate, to select information based on your interests, and the most important, focus to a wide range of audience, from decision makers to students or practitioners. So let me tell you a little bit about how it's structured. Starting in the middle, we find what we want to call the catalog of good news. That is meant to create a full reference database of relevant and coherent multi-scalar initiatives. It is divided by three main types, people, or three main contributors, people, projects, and agency. In the top, we have what we call the Atlas for Opportunity Size, that is meant to be a tool for referencing geographically not only projects, but areas of interest or potentiality. And finally, in the bottom part, we find what we are calling the Manual for Design Intelligence. That is a guide of action meant to articulate the method, the principles, and the logics that are behind these ecological urbanism projects. So let me navigate you through the first design compositions that we have so far. So this is the first design composition we are working with. This is a way that one could visualize one piece of content. And as you can see, it will allow to collect a bunch of media like images, videos, graphs, postcards. At the same time, it will include a description, either a little text or an article, complemented with detailed tagging system of attributes and a little map that locates geographically and links you with this. That is a first version of what is meant to be the Atlas, that will compile geographically, order all the content, but also will allow to zoom in and zoom out to areas of interest, conflict, potentiality, or the project itself. The second type of visualization we are proposing is what we call the matrix, and right now it's still under design. This is the first design composition, but it's meant to be a graphical display that would allow us to organize all the projects according to 1, 2, or 3 variables chosen by the user. So as you can see here, only the projects are displayed by time, but we can add another variable to the graph that converts the timeline into a matrix where content is interactively rearranged, which is especially interested in the way we are learning just by the way information is displayed. we could see if 1 year was especially intense or understand the scale of a project according to time. Another feature we are developing would allow the user not only to rearrange the content in different manners, but also would allow to specialize your search by a complete attribute system, for example, economical resources, disciplines related, authors, density, the type of sphere, that will be popping in and popping out by simply selecting tags related with your selection. And finally, the third mode of visualization we are proposing to catalog all these projects will be the grid that will provide a more conventional display of all the results so people could scroll around that. So that is all for now. Hopefully by the end of the year we will be ready to launch this application, and hopefully not only students, staff, faculty or practitioners, but also the alumni will enjoy this application project. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello, I'm Ingeborg Rocker. I'm an associate professor here, and I'm going to talk about the On the Brink seminar, which is a research in design, which is jointly visited by MDes students and architecture students. And it's really a search in the history of how bricks were used in the field of architecture, and also about the history of how it was misused and how far it became ideologically distorted. Here we see a brick, as you all know it, used to be handmade. This radically changed in the moment industrialization came along and bricks became an engineered product, which greatly has influenced, let's say, the early buildings in Europe, in particular also those with social political interest. Now, as we all know and heard about the era of the modern architects, they rather like to clad brick with white material, or alternatively undo it altogether. So this highly then engineered or increasingly more engineered brick, I think, and this is my argument, would be no longer of relevance today. So the question is, what is the role of brick today? And I would suggest brick is on the brink, given the fact that we are no longer necessarily using mass production, but rather mass customization. So the seminar looks into technology, latest technology, computation, and in how far that causes us to rethink the unit and the standardization of it. This is a speculation. It's a speculation in and through design. We try to be rigorous as we do this. So in this case, for example, we looked at the wall and the typology of the wall and looked in how far through computational means we could stretch the running bond, and by doing this also increase the stability of this wall. Obviously, this is also based on research which is already done at the ETH Zurich. Gamazio Kohler, you probably know. Nevertheless, for us, this was very important also to tackle the typology of the wall. So it's a combination of a bottom-up and a top-down approach. You can see computation helps us here to place the brick successively equal. It's a straight line on top, and it's bulging out, creating actually an inhabitable space in between the two walls. Now, the computer, and this is the fabrication lab downstairs, you probably have seen it today. Martin Bechtold probably showed some of these images already, helped us to conceptualize not only the piece of work, but also to actually build it and realize it. We had to build it in wooden bricks simply because of the weight of the real bricks. So one of the challenge was to transfer the design into coordinates, which then the robotic arm could pick up. We had a 0 point, which you see on the left side, which then successively allowed us to build 12 units, which then became assembled in the pit. Here you see how the robotic arm successively builds up the brick. The brick is glued, mortar is passé in this case, we had some trouble to ensure the precision that had to do with how much glue you actually put onto the bricks. It was still a little bit of a hand operation, as we more or less had to hand deliver the bricks to the location of the pickup. So here you see the action. The project is not only a research or a kind of design-oriented research, but it's also a lot a community project where students come together and work together. This was a team of a total 30 people in the end working on this piece, and it created friendships throughout one particular year here, which still are in place. Here you see last touches. This is in the pit where we had assembled the 12 pieces, and there was a little crack so you could enter. It's about 3 feet wide, and there was this interior space which you see in the next slide. So the whole undulation is simply the maximum and the minimum limits of a bond system, which is stretched, which creates space and stability, and also the effect you witness within the structure. Now, this is still a repetition of a same unit. It's a uniform unit, and yet it's a variation in its placement. The second approach was we vary everything. It's like a customized unit, and it is a customization of how the unit is placed. Now, in this case, and this has limits, obviously, and it was point to show this to the students through how much hassle you go actually by mass customizing everything, because there's a great myth at this point that we can just differentiate anything and showcase it to the world. And so they had to literally build all these units, and they realized that it's not necessarily totally handy to have every single unit being different. So our next approach will be to look at clusters and standardize again parts of those. Nevertheless, so this was a surface which was very easily generated. It is a Limacon surface which has the elegance that one equation actually generates it, and it is more or less generated through 2 circles which are rolling around each other, and then there is a radius which can vary, which then defines the curvature. So I have to speed up, obviously. So this is already then the other economy we had to deal with. How do we make that unit, and how do we place the unit so that we save material? The units were made out of cardboard, due to cost, but also to the pleasure. How can you make out of a 2D something 3-dimensional? Those are the units finally assembled as unit, but still left open. You see on the right side a little tab in order to assemble them then totally. Again, also a great amount of students were involved. Moisen came by when we labored here late nights. It was an incredible sight at the pit. Here we put this rather fragile structure together. We learned our lessons. We will have to make a mock-up next time, 1-to-1, before we go into the full production. Simply gravity hit us severely. And so the piece was up for the review, but collapsed shortly afterwards. But we have a beautiful rendering, and this is it, which reminds of its idealized final stage. So I would like to put forward architecture or design as such as a speculation, as a great resource for research in its own right. Design is research. Thank you.
So they made it look really easy. Some of them used some techniques, actually, to add more slides, I noticed. Very clever. Anyway, I'm very impressed. I think this is quite an effective communications device. I know you've just seen a breadth of work that is extraordinary in its range, in its difference. I think it's an amazing snapshot of the school. Please ask them questions, or if any of you felt cheated by your limited time, you're welcome to add some comments now.
When I visited your exhibit at MoMA, the housing, what was the title of it again? I was struck by the fact that the presentation, and this is a sort of a general comment, the presentation of architecture, with the exception of the 5 structures you had out in the parking lot adjacent to the building, done as models, as scale models, diminish environmentally and diminish scale-wise clearly what you're trying to portray. Have you ever given any thought to how to do this in a different way, to make it more environmentally embracing?
Important points there. One is that was a former life, so it has less to do with the GSD. But I think that specifically with prefabrication, just as a sort of historical note, it actually has And actually maybe Inga and I could debate this about how much mass customization has actually taken off, but all our research indicated that prefabrication had never actually really taken off as much as architects had hoped. And so that prefabricated houses were largely a utopian vision that were manifested by models. So
I agree with you that, the utopian aspects of it, but I'm just talking as someone who still, even at the GSD, as you walk outside and look around, deals with exhibiting aspects of architecture. Have you given any thought to how to make architecture more embracing in an exhibition way? MoMA has always had a problem with this, and I feel that it's a problem for all of us as presenters. How do we deal with it? Although people love dollhouses and they love train models. So.
I think that question actually transcends curators. I think it's really actually for anyone involved with representing architecture, even in publications, because it is inherently harder to represent in a space, because most of the time you can't, unless you build at full scale, you can't bring it inside. So it's a very philosophical question, and we could debate it, and there's much literature on this. So probably not the time and place, but I'd be happy to continue, and I have many thoughts.
I had a question about the environmental application and was wondering if there's an economic model attached to that. Is there a way to make it sustainable and to make it economic as well?
So you refer to the application itself? Or?
Right. Is there a way to make money from that?
Well, I think that question is not for me, but yeah, I guess that our idea is to make it as open as possible, because I think one of the goals of the application is to really embrace a lot of people, a lot of disciplines, and make it as open as possible. So I think, but maybe I hope I'm not making a mistake, that I think the purpose is not to have a revenue out of that. It's more to try to somehow condense all the content that is floating around, that needs somehow to have a little bit of a structure, and put it together into an application that we hope it could somehow it will help to visualize all the things that we are doing, obviously at the GSD and all the faculty related, but also like many practitioners around the world, somehow like to have a space in a new format that is application rather than the web, so people really could have access to this content in a more interesting and visual way.
Yeah, no, I'm just making the assumption that if there's a revenue model associated with it of some kind, that will make it have a longer life and enable it to be sustainable and continue to grow and have new components to it and find more ways to capture innovative things that are going on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We will try to address that for sure. I mean, if this could, be bigger and we can use these resources to make more things, it would be definitely great. Absolutely. Thanks.
When we were here, we could have learned 3 times as much, at least, maybe 30 times as much.
I have a question for Nina. I appreciate your presentation, and I think that the idea is fantastic. Can anybody hear me? All right.
It's for recording.
All over. I guess my question has to do with, have you presented this to the state and talked about things like eminent domain or cost or the ecological or social repercussions of it? It does seem like a very good idea. I was just wondering of the realistic implications.
We presented, this was a studio project as well from last semester, and we presented it to Adrian Benepe, who's the Parks Commissioner for New York City, and Cass Holloway, who at the time was the Commissioner for Transportation in New York City. And the idea was not that it would be entirely realistic to bulldoze a lot of those buildings, obviously, for an ecological gain, but the idea that there is this real threat with water coming in and how to rethink it. And our idea, as were other ideas in the class, were larger than probably reality would allow, but the fact that we were able to have that conversation with people who had a presence right now in the New York City government, they were able to take those ideas. And Adrian Benempey is very much, he's very much in favor of looking at all these ideas and probably taking little bits from them. So that was the end result, which was good. Yeah.
Hello. I got a question for Inga and Kyle. Kyle, you presented a very interesting proposal on issues of sustainability and issues of thermal performance in building envelopes. And Inga, you provided an interesting proposal on the power of computation, the power of design development, and mass customization. And I just wondered if the computational power is in the academic environment. Do you see that integrating with analysis of buildings and sustainable design?
Yeah, to the last part of that question, of course, certainly. But certainly for students, beginning students, we have to remember that the human body is the most sophisticated processor and computational tool that we have at this point. So that remains important. So some of those basic thermodynamic principles are as important as any piece of analytic software that we might have. But of course, once those are productively merged, then we have an interesting future within that domain of architecture.
Yeah, I think, frankly, there's a lot of space for further development in terms of looking at data, real data processing. I think right now we're using it, at least the way we do it in my seminar, rather speculative, frankly. So we're looking here more at the past, perhaps, obsession with geometry. I say past a little jokingly. I think there has been it's still a current obsession as well, but I think there is something which this picks up rather critically. This obsession with this display of this continuous differentiation of a surface. And I think that's something also the seminar needs to tackle critically, being self-critical about, because I think we hit a wall here. You can do that to a certain extent, and also the question of the one-to-one model is, in how far is that an appropriate means of exploration, right? I think it has tremendous pedagogical value because they really engage with materiality and understand also that geometries which easily come in the computer to a point simply do not come that's easily to a point, as we all know, but it's something that they really need to witness, they meaning the students. But I think there is a lot of space for looking at data, environmental data simulations, which I think, as far as I know, we're not yet doing enough, but perhaps soon.
I have one more thought about your question, and that is that any numerical model of reality is as incomplete as it is inaccurate right now. And it also typically only serves to answer small questions at this point. And I think, and maybe this comes back to some of Henry's comments earlier about what a planner or what an architect might need to know to really address the full breadth of some of those questions. I think we probably do need a good 20 or 30 years to really understand what is embedded and what's not embedded in some of these numerical models. And that there's a great deal that's bearing on those sorts of questions. So I think we need a pretty broad approach that tempers our enthusiasm for things like computation and analysis. Yeah.
Going back to Nina, I was very interested in all the surface work, but wondered whether you took into account the infrastructure underground as a limitation, or, I mean, you wanted to have the positive side of everything, but how limiting is it in a case like Manhattan?
In that location specifically, there is not a subway line that runs right now today. They're building the 2nd Avenue, yeah. Everyone who lives in New York. And we considered it. The settling and filtering ponds that we had designed out weren't really deep. And we studied how deep the subway would go, and we looked at it. It wasn't as much of a constraint as it probably in reality would be for the design proposal, but we looked at it as a class what the heights would be, or the depths, I guess. There's also the issue of the East Side Highway Drive, which for the class we got to remove. Under under the assumption that we could, right now a lot of that traffic is being rerouted because of all the security issues down in that area with the police station and everything. We assumed that in the future when this would happen that cars would be less proliferate less in New York City. So there were some assumptions that we made for the sake of the studio.
Thank you very much to everyone. I think this was very interesting, and to make architecture fun is really important. I was very interested in your discussion about buildings and the trouble with buildings and the trouble with architects and architects within the media and within the public perception and within their own perception. And you can take that back all the way to Howard Roark, of course, and the mythology that we tend to perpetuate ourselves as well. How do you think that now that we're in a very different social mode and the way in which we communicate has changed radically, don't you think that part of what you were portraying, that myth is going to be self-destroying and in some ways re-emerging, maybe a different person, or that the emperor has no clothes syndrome will be seen?
I absolutely think that might be the case. Yes, I do. I think that the contemporary trend in architecture can be seen more in the generation of students we have currently in the school being active in projects of building in which they're volunteering for nonprofits, right? and taking action kind of outside of traditional means in which you can just affect a building. Haley, you're working for an artist, right? Oh yeah. Not an architect. Enabling change in the built environment, I think that's a good example of flipping that mythology. So yes, I think that this generation is very invested in circumventing the kind of hierarchy of those myths, and I think that we will in the next 20 years. We're seeing not only increases in enrollment in architecture schools in the last 10 years, there's been tremendous increase in enrollment in architecture schools in general, in accredited programs and in non-accredited programs. And I don't think that's because everybody wants to be Howard Roark. I actually think that's because this generation is deeply conscious of the built environment and how they can participate in it. And I think maybe my point is that there are more ways to participate in it outside of architecture, increasingly. And that will affect how the profession operates, yes. I think it's a very good point. George needs to talk about pasta. Just a little.
I want to know what your favorite shape is.
No, I'm sorry, I seem to have walked into the wrong event. I didn't actually have time to prepare anything related to our very serious teaching and academic involvement with the school. Actually, my favorite pasta is trene, which looks like a building component. Inge would love it. It's the only pasta that actually has something of a right angle into it, which is actually the most difficult thing to produce with the aerothermodynamic manufacturing processes we have. So in that part of the world, if you like, the florid, the blob is actually the norm. And you can't have anything even remotely banal, which we tried because we are actually designing one, but we're being denied at every step in that sense. So trene is the one that's nice.
Can we thank our wonderful panelists? I think you can't deny the fact that we certainly believe in architectural education and research always combined with wit. And this wonderful group have demonstrated that that working with the material of the different disciplines actually through a certain sense of pleasure and enjoyment is something that's necessary. It was very interesting to see how, starting from Harry's description in the previous panel, coming to the end, gradually the school seemed to be getting better and better. Did you notice that? I think we didn't, that wasn't something that we orchestrated. It just happened. It was a natural thing. But it was also interesting to note that, you know, there were disagreements. I mean, Bob Campbell's version of the 60s versus somebody else's, your version of the 60s, totally different. And I think that's one of the charms of the GSD, is that we have hundreds of people in the school and we have hundreds of different opinions about all the different programs and what we should be doing. It's been really an incredible afternoon. I've learned so much about the school, have been so inspired by all of you and all the presentations. One of the things that I think hopefully is coming through with these kinds of presentations and discussions is that it's as important for us to be producing the work, developing that kind of thinking, as it is to deal with its distribution, with its dissemination. And so I know most of you are familiar with the fact that we have a new website. And we really see that website as a very important mechanism for discussion, collaboration with you, but really also communication amongst ourselves. The app that, Susan, you were referring to is in a sense seen as a mechanism for the school acting not only as a forum for the production again, but actually trying to find a way to get things out. The problem is that the sort of traditional forms of publishing are actually extremely slow in a way. And so even something like the ecological urbanism, in the last year and something, they have done, I don't know, a number of editions, but the information actually becomes old relatively quickly. And I think the challenge is, how can we have a body of knowledge, a discourse, but at the same time, really a body of information which complements and supplements that discourse that can stay up to date. And of course, if we can find a way to support that, that becomes the mechanism for developing and continuing the research. So I think that this relationship between the work that's done in the school and its dissemination is very important. The other thing that I probably haven't talked about, and I think it would be great if maybe next year we can discuss these things, is that as we went from the 1940s to the present, there's actually a dramatic shift in the size of the school, from a relatively small 200 and something school to a school that is now 700 and something graduate students, and perhaps growing still a little bit more for very particular reasons. And that actually is also a very important thing in terms of the role of the GSD within the larger university, but the role of the GSD in relation to the production of knowledge amongst the various disciplines within the school, which again, we have not discussed so specifically, because historically architecture has been the dominant discourse in some degree. And we certainly don't want to reduce the value and importance of architecture. But the question of what do you need to actually engage in a conversation across different disciplines and with the rest of the university, these are key issues that face an institution today in terms of really the kind of the realities of design thinking and design knowledge. And of course, there's the bigger issue also that would be great to discuss at some future date, that how do all these disciplines really relate to this broader umbrella of design in a way, since when we talk to many people outside of the GSD, they think we are a school of industrial design. It's only after we explain things that they realize that we actually don't necessarily do industrial design, even though our art design and public domain, for example, programs are reaching into those domains. So the question of what is the next phase of the school, what is its role in relation to the rest of the university, I hope you've had a glimpse of some of those thoughts and ideas based on the incredible presentations that people have made today and all your contribution that I think has helped us, will help us. I hope that you will continue to engage us in this discussion. But anyway, this is absolutely the right time for a stiff drink, and so I would like to invite you to join us for a celebration outside and for more informal discussion. Thank you.